The church bells tolled across the grey skies of Yorkshire. Rain tapped against the stained glass windows as mourners in black gathered inside St. Mary's. Verona Clark stood near the coffin, her hands trembling as she clutched the hymn sheet. She tried to remain composed, but grief tightened her throat each time she looked at the polished wood. Her son Oliver, only 8 years old, sat quietly in the front pew. His small hand clutched hers, a silent anchor in the storm. Verona whispered a prayer, asking for strength to carry her through this unbearable moment. The vicar spoke solemnly about a mother's love, about devotion and sacrifice. But before he could finish, the heavy doors of the church creaked open. A group of uniformed officers entered. Gasps rose among the mourners as the lead inspector strode down the aisle, his eyes fixed on Verona. "Verona Clark," he announced, his voice firm, "you are under arrest on suspicion of murder." The room erupted in shocked whispers. Verona froze, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. Her aunt, Margaret, stepped forward from the pews, her face pale but determined. "She poisoned her own mother," Margaret declared, her voice sharp as a blade. "She wanted the inheritance, the house, the land. I told you all this day would come." The inspector gestured to his officers. 2 of them moved swiftly, taking Verona by the arms. Oliver cried out, clinging to his mother's dress, but the officers pulled her away. "I did nothing," Verona pleaded, her voice breaking. "I loved my mother. I swear on my life." The crowd remained divided, some turned their faces in pity, others in suspicion. Margaret lifted a small bottle from her handbag and raised it for all to see. "This," she said coldly, "was found in Verona's kitchen. Digitalis. Enough to stop a heart." All eyes fixed on Verona, now pale as the stone floor beneath her feet. The inspector signaled, and the officers began leading her out of the church. Oliver suddenly stood, his voice trembling yet loud enough to cut through the chaos. "Wait," he cried, his eyes blazing with determination. "I have proof. It's on my iPad." The church fell silent. Every mourner turned to look at the boy, his small figure standing alone against the tide of accusation. The inspector halted, his hand still gripping Verona's arm. He turned slowly to face Oliver, his brow furrowed in doubt. "What do you mean, lad?" the inspector asked, his voice echoing through the silent church. Oliver's hands shook as he clutched his school bag. From it, he pulled out his iPad, the screen smeared with fingerprints of a child who had spent many nights hidden under the covers watching things he was not meant to see. "I recorded something," Oliver whispered, his voice trembling. "The night before Gran died. I saw someone in the kitchen. It wasn't Mum." Gasps rippled through the congregation. Margaret's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "That child is confused," she snapped. "He's frightened, and he's saying nonsense to protect his mother. It's exactly what she's trained him to do." But Oliver stood firm. He tapped the screen, and the faint glow lit up his determined face. The video played. A shaky recording appeared. The dim light of the Clark family's kitchen revealed a figure moving quietly by the counter. The face was blurred in shadow, but the posture, the way the hand grasped the bottle, it was unmistakable. It was Margaret. The mourners gasped louder this time. A woman in the back crossed herself, and the vicar lowered his gaze to the floor. Oliver's voice quavered as the recording played. "I couldn't sleep. I wanted water. I saw her. She poured something into Gran's medicine." The inspector's jaw tightened. He looked from the iPad to Margaret, who now stood rigid, her hands clutching her handbag as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "This is ridiculous," Margaret hissed, her voice rising. "The boy tampered with the video. He's clever with these machines. Do not let a child's trick decide a woman's fate." But Oliver stepped closer, his eyes brimming with tears yet fierce with resolve. "I didn't tamper. I just wanted to help Gran. And now you're lying." The inspector raised a hand for silence. The storm outside seemed to grow heavier, rain hammering against the church windows. Tension pressed down on the room until every breath felt stolen. "Margaret Clark," the inspector said slowly, his voice like iron, "you will come with us for questioning." Margaret's face twisted, caught between fury and fear. She opened her mouth as though to protest, but before she could speak, a loud crash erupted from the back of the church. The doors burst open once again. This time, it was not the police. A stranger in a rain-soaked coat strode in, his eyes wild, his voice desperate. "Stop everything!" he shouted. "You've all got it wrong. I know who really killed her." The stranger stood in the center aisle, his shoulders heaving, rain dripping from his coat and pooling on the stone floor. Every eye turned towards him, the storm outside seeming to fade beneath the storm he carried within. The inspector narrowed his gaze. "And who might you be, barging into a house of God with such claims?" The man's chest rose and fell heavily. He pulled back his hood, revealing a pale face lined with exhaustion and fear. His voice cracked when he spoke. "My name is Jonathan Reed, and I was Alice Clark's nurse during her final weeks." A murmur rippled through the mourners. Verona froze, her breath catching. She remembered him faintly, a shadow at the edge of the hospital bed, someone she thought was merely another attendant. Margaret's lips pressed tightly, but her eyes darted, just for a second, with unease. Jonathan continued, his voice steadier now though trembling with urgency. "You are all wrong about this. Yes, I saw Margaret by the medicine cupboard, but she wasn't the only one. The truth is, Alice was poisoned over weeks, not days. And the one who supplied the poison wasn't Margaret." The inspector stiffened. "Then who?" The church fell silent, the air thick with dread. Jonathan's hands shook as he reached into his coat pocket. From it, he pulled a small brown vial, its label half torn, the glass clouded with residue. "This," he said, holding it high, "is what I found hidden beneath Alice's mattress. I kept it because I feared what it meant. But tonight, seeing you accuse the wrong person, I can no longer stay silent." Gasps echoed again, louder this time. Verona's knees weakened, and she gripped the pew for balance. Margaret staggered a step, her face draining of color. Yet before she could defend herself, Jonathan turned sharply, his eyes falling on someone else in the congregation. His finger trembled as he pointed. "It was you." The crowd followed his gaze. Verona's heart lurched as she realized who he was accusing. All eyes followed Jonathan's trembling finger until it landed upon Edward Clark, the eldest son, seated in the second pew. Edward's face blanched, though he quickly tried to mask it with a scowl. "This is absurd," he barked, his voice louder than the thunder outside. "How dare you slander me in my mother's own funeral?" The inspector took a step closer. His hand rested firmly upon Edward's shoulder, though not yet in restraint. "Calm yourself, Mr. Clark. Let us hear what the man has to say." Jonathan's grip tightened around the vial. Edward visited Alice more often than anyone knew. Not with kindness, not with grief, but with threats. "I heard him late at night, whispering that her will must change, that his inheritance depended on it. When she refused, the poisoning began." The air thickened with shock. Verona's breath came shallow, her mind scrambling through memories of Edward's strained visits, his sudden bursts of temper, his strange silences. Margaret shook her head, her voice cracking. "I thought it was me they suspected. But it was you, Edward, all along." Edward rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone. His eyes darted wildly about the church, as though seeking escape. "Lies!" he shouted. "This vagrant seeks only to profit from mischief. You believe a stranger over your own blood." The inspector's jaw tightened. "Stranger or not, his evidence carries weight. A vial hidden beneath your mother's bed cannot be ignored." Edward's fists clenched. His entire frame shook, his denial growing thinner with each word. Then, with a sudden burst, he bolted towards the side door of the church. The congregation screamed as the inspector lunged forward, chasing after him. The doors slammed against the storm outside, rattling the ancient wood. Verona stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had long feared Edward's temper, but never imagined it could reach this. Now, with the inspector in pursuit, one question haunted her: would Edward escape into the night, or would the truth finally be cornered within the storm? The heavy doors of St. Bartholomew's burst open as Edward flung himself into the tempest. The rain lashed against his face, the wind tearing at his coat like claws. Lightning split the sky, throwing his figure into stark relief as he sprinted across the churchyard. "Stop, Clark!" the inspector roared, his boots pounding against the sodden ground. 2 constables, summoned for order, gave chase through the gravestones slick with moss and rain. Verona staggered to the doorway, clutching the stone arch as the storm sprayed her cheeks. Her heart lurched at the sight of Edward fleeing, his silhouette weaving through the tombstones of their ancestors. Inside, Jonathan's voice carried faintly over the commotion. "If you let him vanish tonight, the truth will never be brought to light." Edward's breath came ragged, each stride carrying him deeper into darkness. He hurdled low walls, his shoes slipping upon wet grass, desperation lending him a terrible strength. He knew the grounds better than most. As a child, he had played hide and seek amidst these graves, now they served him as cover. But the inspector was relentless. Step by step, the gap narrowed, the beam of a lantern bobbing closer with every flash of lightning. Verona pressed a trembling hand to her lips, whispering prayers into the storm. Part of her wished Edward would stop, surrender, plead his innocence if any remained. Another part, darker, knew this pursuit could only end in ruin. Suddenly, Edward's foot struck uneven earth. He stumbled, crashing hard against a weathered headstone, his cry swallowed by thunder. For an instant, he lay sprawled in the mud, gasping. Then, wild-eyed, he dragged himself up and staggered onward, blood mingling with rain down his temple. The inspector raised a hand, signaling his men. "Do not lose him," he bellowed. The chase plunged beyond the churchyard gates, into the twisting lanes of Ravenscroft village. Windows shuttered, lamps flickered, and dogs barked as the storm swallowed them all. Verona clutched the pew beside her, her entire body trembling. The storm outside was fierce, but the storm within her family threatened to tear far more apart. And with Edward still running, she knew the truth had not yet been caught. The storm raged over Ravenscroft as Edward stumbled into the narrow lanes, his breath ragged, his soaked coat clinging to his frame. Lanterns swung wildly behind him, the inspector's men shouting as they gained ground. The cobbled streets were slick, each step a battle not to fall. Edward's boots splashed through puddles, his mind racing faster than his legs. "If I can reach the old mill by the river, I might vanish into the marshes." But the storm betrayed him. A flash of lightning revealed his figure to the pursuers, his shadow stretched long across the stones. "Clark!" The inspector's voice rang sharp, cutting through thunder. "You cannot outrun this. Surrender yourself." Edward's chest heaved. He turned into an alley, only to find it ended in a crumbling wall. Trapped. The shouts grew louder, the glow of lanterns flooded the narrow passage. For a moment, he pressed his hand against the wall, rain and sweat mingling on his brow. His thoughts swirled, not of escape, but of Verona's tear-streaked face in the church, of Jonathan's unyielding eyes. The inspector entered the alley, flanked by constables. He leveled his lantern, its harsh light falling upon Edward's trembling form. "Enough," the inspector said firmly. "Running only deepens suspicion. If you are innocent, prove it. If guilty, better face justice here than flee into ruin." Edward's eyes darted, wild and desperate, yet beneath the panic something cracked. His shoulders sagged as though the weight of the storm itself pressed him down. "You do not understand," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "There are things buried with my mother, truths you should never unearth." The inspector's brows furrowed. "What truths?" Edward's lips quivered, rain trickling down his face like tears. He looked beyond the inspector, as if seeking an escape not of flesh but of conscience. Then, with a hollow laugh swallowed by thunder, he muttered, "The funeral was never meant to be hers alone." The inspector stepped forward, his face hardening. "Explain yourself, Clark." But Edward only shook his head, his words dissolving into the storm, leaving more questions than answers. The storm did not relent, but the inspector's men dragged Edward through the sodden streets until the looming shadow of Ravenscroft Manor swallowed them whole. Verona and Jonathan had been brought there too, summoned under the guise of questioning. The inspector wasted no time. He demanded the caretaker open the chapel doors at the far end of the manor grounds. The iron key turned with a groan, revealing a cold hall that smelled of stone and decay. Edward stumbled forward, his eyes fixed not on the altar but on the slabs beneath it. His voice cracked, barely more than a murmur. "It is not above, but below, where you will find what you seek." The inspector frowned but motioned for lanterns to be brought down. A hidden passage was revealed, stone steps descending into the bowels of Ravenscroft. Verona shivered as the air grew colder, Jonathan tightening his jaw as he held her hand. The stairway ended in a crypt, the walls lined with niches where generations of Clark ancestors lay in silence. Cobwebs hung like veils, dust shifting as though disturbed by more than footsteps. Edward moved towards a sealed tomb, his trembling hand brushing the carved name, Margaret Clark, his mother. His breath came uneven, his shoulders bowed. "She was not buried alone," he whispered. The inspector's lantern cast long shadows across the chamber. "Open it," he ordered. With a heave, the stone cover was slid aside. Verona gasped, her hand flying to her lips. Jonathan stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Inside lay not one body but two, the remains of Margaret Clark, and beside her, a smaller coffin wedged within the grave. The inspector's face hardened. "What is this, Clark?" Edward's knees buckled, and he fell to the damp floor. "It was never meant to be found," he croaked. "They swore it would stay buried, the child, the shame, the secret of our blood." The inspector bent closer. "Whose child?" Edward lifted his tear-streaked face, the words clawing their way out of him. "My father's, and not by his wife." The chamber fell silent, broken only by the drip of water from the stones. Verona staggered back, her mind spinning. Jonathan's grip on her hand tightened, his eyes blazing with the weight of revelation. The storm above seemed to roar louder, as if the manor itself recoiled from the truth unearthed beneath its foundations. The inspector's voice echoed sharply in the crypt. "So this is what you sought to hide, Clark. A bastard buried in silence." Edward shook his head desperately. "Not mine. I was a child myself when it happened. It was my father's sin, his betrayal of Margaret. She bore the shame, and I was forced to guard it." Verona stared at the smaller coffin, her skin prickling as if the very stones pressed the secret upon her. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And you thought you could carry this deception into eternity? That no one would ever know?" Edward's eyes blazed, fevered with despair. "I had no choice. Ravenscroft is built on pride, on legacy. If this truth emerged, the Clark name would collapse. My mother demanded it be hidden, she begged me to protect it." The inspector motioned to his men. "This evidence cannot be silenced any longer. The Crown will hear of it." Edward lurched forward, grasping at the inspector's sleeve. "You do not understand. That child was not merely my father's disgrace, it is the reason everything has unraveled. The inheritance, the feuds, even the madness that haunts me, it all began here, in this tomb." Verona's voice trembled. "Then who was the child's mother?" Edward's face contorted. He looked at her, then at Jonathan, as if the answer itself might curse them. She was a maid of Ravenscroft. A woman wronged, cast aside, her life extinguished before she could speak her truth. The inspector's lantern flickered, shadows dancing grotesquely upon the crypt walls. You mean to say she was silenced? Edward lowered his head, his shoulders quaking. Buried with her child. It was ordered, and I could not stop it. A hush fell. Verona felt her knees weaken, Jonathan holding her upright. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though centuries of secrets pressed upon them. And then, one of the inspector's men gasped. He had stepped deeper into the crypt, his lantern casting light upon another sealed niche. Unlike the others, this one bore no name. Its stonework was fresher, the mortar newer, as if it had been concealed not a century past, but far more recently. The inspector strode forward. Open it. The man obeyed, prizing the slab aside. The stench that rolled out was sharp, raw, and wrong. Inside lay not ancient bones, but a body still clothed in decaying fabric, a body no more than a few years in the grave. Verona staggered back, her hand to her mouth. Jonathan froze, his eyes dark with shock. The inspector turned slowly to Edward, his voice low, dangerous. This is no ancestor. Edward's scream tore through the crypt, a sound of anguish and terror. I told you, it never ends. Ravenscroft will never let us go. The lantern light quivered as the storm above thundered in reply. The drawing room of Ravensmoor lay heavy with silence. The storm had long since passed, leaving only the ticking of the great-grandfather clock and the faint hiss of the dying fire. Edward sat slumped in the armchair, his wrists bound, his once defiant face now hollow with defeat. Inspector Harrow stood before him, arms folded. It is over, Edward. You will hang if you persist in silence. Speak now, for your mother's sake. Edward's head lifted slowly, his eyes bloodshot. You do not understand. None of you ever did. Mother promised me the estate when I was a boy. She said Ravensmoor would be mine. But as the years passed, she turned her favor to Verona, to Margaret, to anyone but me. She betrayed me. I only sought what was mine. His words fell like stones, each heavier than the last. Margaret's hands trembled as she covered her mouth. Verona could not move, her heart breaking at the revelation. Jonathan stepped forward, his voice quiet yet firm. And so you poisoned her. Not out of desperation, but pride. You could not bear the thought of being denied. Edward gave a hollow laugh. Denied by my own mother. What son could endure that? The inspector's tone grew steely. A good son. One who honored her in life, not stole her breath in death. Silence stretched until Edward sagged back, his fight gone. Then let it be written. Edward Clarke killed Alice Clarke, his own mother. Let Ravensmoor curse my name forever. A gasp rippled through the room, but Edward did not resist as the inspector led him away. The heavy door closed with a final thud, echoing through the old house like the toll of a bell. Verona sat beside Margaret, taking her cold hand. It is finished, she whispered, though the words trembled with sorrow. Yet as the flames in the hearth flickered low, Verona's eyes drifted to the shadows above the mantel. For a brief moment, she thought she saw Alice's portrait smile, faint and forgiving, as though her spirit had finally found peace. And Ravensmoor, at last, fell silent.